stop the morning and evening sacrifice. Rabbi, can you please explain how Jews receive forgiveness of sin today, and will the Messiah be the one to forgive sins? Thank you.
Yeah, that question is one of those that I don't know where to begin. So let's roll it this way. So as it turns out, what you're expressing is very much what's on the minds of Christians. Christians really think that in the ancient world, the way Jews atoned for sins was through a sacrificial system. If you robbed a bank, you brought a sacrifice. If you if you ate a cheeseburger, you just brought a sacrifice. As it turns out, that wasn't the case. As it turns out, in biblical times, you had to repent for intentional sins. You had to confess your sin, turn back to God, renounce your sin, and God would forgive you. In fact, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13, when King David is confronted by the prophet Nathan in a private conversation, if you ask me why later it's important that it was a private conversation, I'll explain it. Nathan presents David with a juridical parable. And Nathan conveys to David that, in fact, he is the one who committed an outrageous sin. David, in 2 words, Chatasi la Hashem, which means I've sinned before the Lord, was enough for God to peer into his heart. He knew that it was broken, and Nathan replied, the Lord has already forgiven you. No sacrifice. And as it turns out, the sacrificial system for sin is in 3 areas, and it's not the areas that anyone who grew up in the Christian world would expect. Predominantly is for unintentional sins. There's an asham, that means if you confess the sin, again, weakening the original act. And if you brought a sacrifice in a state of impurity and you wanted to show God that you really regretted what you did, you would do it demonstrably by bringing an offering in a state of purity, or the high priest doing it for you on Yom Kippur. So that's not a vicarious atonement, Leviticus 16:16. As it turns out, the prophets anticipated that people would become obsessed with a sacrificial system. In the 7th chapter of the book of Jeremiah, a speech, an oracle that the prophet gave that nearly got him killed. But in it, he criticized the children of Israel and told them that they were very foolish by thinking that sacrifices were going to help them. In that context, Jeremiah is speaking toward the end of the First Temple period, dissuading his listeners that any sacrifice could possibly help them. Any sacrifice would enable them to defeat the Babylonian Empire. And he said, stop screaming, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. No. And in verse 21, he says, when you went out of Egypt, that you should bring a sacrifice for sin. It was well anticipated in the Hebrew Bible that people would misapprehend this ritual, which really brought you closer to God. It wasn't some weird ritual that simply expiated sin like in the pagan world. People were under the apprehension that they could, that somehow the blood would save them. I speak about this a lot in Let's Get Biblical, both Volume 1 and Volume 2. In Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, that's really important because Hosea is speaking to a northern kingdom that very often didn't have